We had a 5-year gap between the release of Two Gun Kid and the Sunset Riders and Blaze of Glory / Apache Skies. This time, only a year would pass between the publication of Apache Skies and Marvel's next Western series, and it would definitely go in a different direction. This new miniseries would continue our focus on Johnny Bart, aka the Rawhide Kid, but having since returned to an appearance much more like his 50s and 60s design. Rawhide was back in his all blues, with armbands circling his biceps, 4 large white buttons running down either side of his top, a crisp white cowboy hat, and bright red hair. This is the Rawhide Kid as Jack Kirby or John Severin would have drawn him. And I'll be honest, it's a pretty nice look. It's very crisp, very clean, it is bright and noticeable. It doesn't look like something that you would actually see in the Wild West, but it is a cool design in order to make a Western hero stand out in a crowd. This design, by the way, is drastically different from the version that we have been reading about in Ostrander's comics, who appears much older, much dirtier, and much more realistic. Ostrander's Rawhide looks like he's just stepped out of a mine that he's been camping in for 6 weeks with no access to a bath. This classic version of Rawhide that we're going to be reading about looks very cleaned up and pressed like he is ready for church on Sunday. Not only do we have the return of a classic design, but we have a classic artist drawing this comic as well. John Severin is an artist best known for the work that he did for EC Comics, his Western work for Marvel, his role in being one of the founding artists for Mad Magazine, and the work that he did for Cracked Magazine over the course of 45 years. So this guy knows his stuff. According to his Wikipedia page, Severin was actually so good at drawing people of different nationalities that if Jack Kirby didn't have reference for them on hand, he would just look at Severin's work. Jack, the King Kirby, one of the godfathers of American comic books, used John Severin's work as reference. That is a pretty impressive bragging right. Not only did Severin draw some of the old Western books like Kid Colt Outlaw and The Ringo Kid, but he also drew some of Rawhide Kid's original ongoing series as well. So it is pretty appropriate that he gets to return for this particular volume. The author of this volume is someone totally new to the Rawhide Kid, and that is a man named Ron Zimmerman. At the time, Zimmerman had mostly worked in Hollywood on various TV shows, mostly comedies, and as a guest on The Howard Stern Show. In 2001, Marvel had found some amount of success by hiring experienced film writers like J. Michael Straczynski and Kevin Smith to work on their books. Zimmerman was the latest addition to that lineup. Best known for his comedic styling as a satirist, or, quoting Dictionary.com, one who uses humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to expose and criticize people's stupidity or vices, particularly in the context of contemporary politics and other topical issues. End quote. He had done a few one-shot stories for Marvel or limited series, but they weren't anything terribly notable. They weren't very terrible, either, to be fair. The general consensus online seems to be that they're fine. Eventually, though, he landed the gig on the Rawhide Kid. And let me tell you, I remember people hating this comic. Why did they hate it? Well, the only reason that I knew of, back in early 2000, was because Zimmerman had made the Rawhide Kid gay. And that is all I knew when I picked this particular comic up. So let's break it down. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.7, the Rawhide Kid MAX series. Much like Apache Skies before it, this particular miniseries was published under the Max imprint line. For those who missed my explanation last episode, the Max line was Marvel's attempt to publish comics aimed at an older audience. This would allow Marvel to tell stories featuring more mature topics, or show naked people, or use extreme violence, or, the worst offense of all in the world of comic books, use swear words. Yeah, this is some real adult stuff, people. The story takes place in a small town called Wells Junction and revolves around its sheriff, a man named Matt Morgan. Morgan is a recent transplant to Wells Junction after the death of his wife, who died of consumption, known today as tuberculosis. He came here with his son, Toby, who's maybe like 8 or 9, and transitioned from being a farmer to being a sheriff. For the most part, it's a good life. Wells Junction is quiet. There's a cute school teacher named Laura Ingalls that Morgan has a crush on but won't say anything about, and, well, like I said, life is pretty good. So naturally, that's not going to last long. An outlaw named Cisco Pike rode into town one day with his gang, easily a dozen rowdy, loud, rude, violent men on horseback. When Morgan goes to investigate their arrival, meeting them at the local saloon, he can see that Pike is a man with a chip on his shoulder and a bad attitude. So he explains that it is the law in Wells Junction that no one can wear a gun save for the law, meaning him. The Earp brothers have done something similar in Tombstone, and it seems to be going pretty well for them. If Pike and his gang want to stay in Wells Junction, they'll need to turn their guns over to him. And Cisco Pike, well, he doesn't care much to do that. Morgan's deputy attempts to back him up, but this confrontation comes down to a quick draw contest. And Pike wins, shooting Morgan in his right hand, his gun hand, and his right lower leg, dropping him to the floor. He shoots the deputy right in the chest, outright killing him. Pike leaves Morgan alive, because now he knows who the fastest gun in the West is, and he knows better than to cross him again. The goons throw Morgan and the deputy's body out into the street, and Morgan's son, Toby, and his friends run over to them. A voice calls them off, though. The Rawhide Kid stands over Morgan. The sheriff begs to be taken to the doctor, and don't let his boy see him like this. Rawhide scoffs. Please, it's 2 bullets and some bruises, you'll be fine. By now, Pike's gang has gathered on the porch outside of the saloon, and they're watching this living legend of the West. Rawhide just crosses his arms and stares at them. And then he tells them, to shoo, go on, get back in that saloon, or I'm gonna get good and mad now. Thrown by Rawhide's confident and yet nonchalant attitude, the gang goes back inside. The main thought on their mind as they do so? How nicely dressed the Rawhide Kid is. Wow, what a handsome guy. And so begins our adventure. The Rawhide Kid spends this entire series attempting to back up Matt Morgan as he tries to do his job and run off Cisco Pike and his gang, prove himself to his son and to the woman that he loves, and in general, just to do the right thing. Having watched his father get soundly beaten by a criminal, Toby loses all confidence in his father, actually admitting that he is ashamed of Morgan's inability to bring Pike to justice. Because here's the thing, this isn't the only time that Matt tries. And it isn't the only time that Matt fails, either. It's also not the only time that he does so in direct view of his son, or the town. And Morgan quickly loses their confidence, too. Having been drawn into this now, Rawhide does his best to support Morgan. He has a variety of reasons for doing so, as well. To begin with, and Rawhide outright states this, he rides around the West, he finds trouble, and then he does what he can to help stop it. It's literally the thing that he does. But Rawhide can also appreciate Morgan's moral fiber. Despite Toby urging his father to just take his gun and, go shoot Pike, and despite the fact that the townsfolk are kind of demanding that he do it too, Morgan stands firm. He refuses to kill Pike. Even if you are running off a gang of bandits, killing them is still murder. And that's what the town and his son are asking for. Whatever it takes to bring peace back to their town, that's what the townsfolk want Morgan to do, And Morgan refuses to do it, because killing is wrong, and he is the sheriff and he is not above the law. As Morgan's relationship with his son continues to suffer, at one point Rawhide even berates Toby for wishing that Rawhide was Toby's dad instead. Morgan tells Rawhide about how much he loves his son, and wants to be the hero that Toby wants him to be, and this touches Rawhide as well. We see in a flashback that Rawhide was once tied to a tree and beaten by other kids for being a girly boy. But when his father saw this, Rawhide thought that he was going to come save him. But no, his father actually added to the abuse, ashamed by his son's behavior. So seeing a father who is so devoted to uplifting his son and so devoted to trying to set a good example for him, well, it just gets Rawhide right where he lives. Rawhide gathers up the townsfolk, and here we get an interesting scene. The townsfolk initially complain that this is the part of the story when the Rawhide Kid is going to ask them to band together and help him fight off these outlaws. "Yeah," one of them says, "and do his job for him." They quickly decide that they don't want to risk their lives fighting Pike's gang. They should just let the outlaws do what they want, burn a few buildings, rape a few whores, and they can just come back the next day and rebuild everything. That's the way of the West. But when Rawhide finally does address the townsfolk, he says no, he doesn't want them to fight at all. Get out of town. There isn't anything that he has seen these people do that gives him confidence in their ability to be of any help at all. So get on out of here. Bye. Honestly, they would just get in his way. So now the townspeople are insulted, and they almost decide to help Rawhide, but out of spite. Which I thought was going to be a really interesting way of showing how skilled and inspirational Rawhide is, that he's able to manipulate the townsfolk into doing this good deed by appealing to their worst nature. That's a pretty clever and fun way to use the town banding together trope to tell this story. At least it is, until the town's mayor reminds them that Rawhide is giving them a free pass from risking their lives, and then they all agree to skip town. Laura does do her best to berate the town for their behavior and the way that they're willing to abandon Matt, but they don't care. They're cowards, sure, but that beats dying. Rawhide ends up capturing one of Pike's men, a guy named Red Duck, and he uses him to lure Pike and his gang back into town that night. Rawhide defeats the various members of Pike's gang, either with his fists or with bullets, until it finally comes down to the confrontation with Pike. Despite being wounded, and limping, and one-handed, Morgan goes with Rawhide in order to confront Cisco Pike. Morgan might not win a fight, but he won't back down from one either. They confront Pike in the street, with Morgan telling him that he is under arrest. If you couldn't guess, this ends in another gunfight, and somehow Morgan is still the guy who manages to get shot, while Rawhide is the one who manages to shoot every single one of Pike's men. Hit in the leg and shoulder, Morgan drops to the ground, leaving Rawhide to face Pike alone. After some tough talk, they draw pistols and fire. And Rawhide looks down, surprised to see a bullet hole in his chest. Watching from inside the nearby jail for safety, Toby and Laura both cry out. Toby for Rawhide, and Laura for Morgan, who now faces Pike wounded and alone. And he doesn't exactly have a great track record in facing Pike hale and hearty. Only managing to get up on his knees, Morgan faces down Pike one last time. The outlaw can't believe that Morgan is going to try this again. But Rawhide was Morgan's friend, and his son and the woman that he loves are in that building. He is not going to let Pike anywhere near them. So go for your gun. Pike does, firing off 4 more shots. But this time, he is the one who misses. And Morgan didn't. Shot in the chest, Pike falls flat on his face, and Toby and Laura run out to Morgan. Toby hugs his dad, telling him that he is proud of him and that he loves him. "Why?" Morgan asks, ready to be disgusted. "'Cause I killed a man?" "No," Toby replies. because you tried not to." Morgan smiles, relieved, and returns the hug one-armed. He tells his son that he loves him too. Laura, in the meantime, has rushed over to the Rawhide Kid's side, and he's still alive. He quietly asks her to hide the metal skillet that he has inside of his shirt and the small derringer that he just used to kill Cisco Pike. No sense taking away Morgan's victory now. We then get a one-page scene of Matt Morgan and Laura Ingalls' wedding with Rawhide in attendance, and then it is time for him to move on. He rides off into the sunset with Toby crying for him to come back, and that's it. And as hated as this series was at the time of its release, overall, I really enjoyed this. We have a pretty good physical threat in Cisco Pike, and we have a good emotional threat with Toby losing faith in and respect for his father. This half of the narrative works really well for me, for a number of reasons. First off, obviously, I like the morals that are presented by Matt Morgan. Morgan is a man of the law, and he does his best to represent those laws. He tries to arrest Pike, not kill him, because that's the law, and honestly, it's the right thing to do. Even when the town itself is cool with Morgan just killing him, he refuses. That's great! And we see Rawhide not only support Morgan's behavior physically, but vocally as well. He constantly defends Morgan from Toby's recriminations, from the drunk town doctor who patches him up after his various encounters, and from the rest of the town itself. When the Rawhide Kid looks at Morgan, he sees a man who is a hero. And this is important to remember because the Rawhide Kid is an outlaw. Despite the legends surrounding Rawhide and his exploits, he is not a lawman of any kind. He's a vigilante, riding around, shooting bad guys illegally. That's why he is okay with being the one who kills Pike at the end and giving Morgan the credit for it. Rawhide does not need to be a law-abiding sheriff and role model, but Morgan does. This storyline also contains my favorite personal theme of this series, which is the presentation of masculinity. This is represented in two different ways through our two lead characters. Morgan is everything that a man should be emotionally. He is open about his feelings, he confronts his problems and challenges head on, and even when he fails, he tries again. We even get to have a moment in issue 2 where Morgan doubts himself. So he has doubts, he has insecurities throughout this series, but he manages to overcome them at the end because he doesn't give up. He does come across as pretty stiff in the narrative, or as Rawhide says, he is stoic, but I think that the storytelling with Morgan is super great. On the other side of the coin, we have Rawhide. I love the reveal of his past, that he was teased and bullied for being, quote, a sissy boy, and that instead, he has grown up to be one of the greatest legends of the Marvel West. He's smarter than anyone else in the room, he is strong in a fistfight, he is the fastest draw in the West, and, as pointed out in the comic several times, he is a dang fine dresser, too. Rawhide is everything that a kid in the 1800s wants to be, and he is gay on top of that. And I don't know about you, dear listener, but growing up in the 90s, I was definitely presented with a certain image of gay men by television. Fashionable, physically weak, overly sarcastic, chatty, and effeminate. I understand that this is a stereotype, and my interactions with people from the LGBTQ+ community have definitely helped me to overcome those stereotypes as I've gotten older. Those stereotypes were presented to me by entertainment, and I love finding a comic book, a form of entertainment, like this that challenges all of those stereotypes. I do have to say that Rawhide's personality, like his speaking voice and the way that he is presented to us, is fairly stereotypical, though. He is a fashionable dresser, and he not only insults Laura's sense of fashion several times throughout the story, but he actually gives her a makeover at the end of it. And a bunch of characters comment on how nicely dressed Rawhide is, so the story is making a point of reinforcing his looks. I counted at least 5 appreciable compliments about Rawhide's look in the first 2 issues alone. So while the book does challenge the stereotype of what a gay man is, it also does reinforce some of those stereotypes as well. As a straight man, I can't really say whether Rawhide's behavior comes off as offensive or not, and I would love to have the perspective of somebody in the LGBTQ+ community on this book. Rawhide leans just a smidge towards cringe for me, but again, that's for me. Otherwise, I really like Rawhide in this. I suppose I should say that Rawhide's sexuality is never outright stated within the comic, it's just hinted at. And by hinted at, I mean that we are bludgeoned by a baseball bat with constant innuendos and jokes, generally from Rawhide himself. Most of the time when someone else comments on it, it's something like, "Well, that Rawhide kid sure is a strange cowboy, but he is one hell of a good dresser." I would say that this is one of the areas that Zimmerman really fails at in the narrative, as most of the jokes just aren't funny. Mostly they elicited eye rolls from me, so, that's kind of tough, reading a book by a comedian who's not really comedian-y. The covers for this book, though, definitely play with the idea that Rawhide Kid is gay. Each cover is done by a different artist, and each one of them handles the subject differently. The first cover, for example, has Rawhide holding a pistol pointed down in front of his crotch, making the gun's phallic design really work for him. The second cover has a pistol holster doing the same thing, but we're super zoomed in on it. The third cover has Rawhide in a saloon, stocked with boobalicious beauties, and he sure does not look happy about it. While the covers are a bit in your face about Rawhide's sexuality, I actually think that they're kinda clever and really cute. The different artists all have their own take and style. They're all really well executed, and you get the basic idea of the comic really easily. The cover for number 4 is perhaps my personal favorite, depicting Rawhide having drawn on a cheater at a card table, but rather than holding down the cheater's hand in order to expose his cards, Rawhide just has a gentle hand resting on top of the cheater's. It's cute, and upon first glance, it just looks like a standard image from a Western. Even Bugs Bunny played with this kind of image. But then you look closer, and you see Rawhide resting his hand on the cheaters, and you get it. And it's kinda cute. I read a long article online examining Zimmerman's writing on another Marvel book called Ultimate Adventures, trying to get a feel for his writing style. Before I wrote this episode, I hadn't read anything of Zimmerman's work before, and while I don't mind judging this particular book for what it is, I don't really know how indicative this particular comic is of the rest of Zimmerman's writing. The author of the article, Zach Smith, pointed out an interesting thing, though, and it did help to inform the way I read this book. As someone who wrote primarily for TV before coming to write comics, Zimmerman's scripts are very dialogue-heavy. I didn't really notice this at first, as the late 80s and early 90s era of comics that I grew up in had tons of dialogue and exposition boxes in them, so it's just not weird to me to see this. But Zimmerman is used to having an actor deliver those lines, and in the comics, we do not have an actor who reinterprets the dialogue for us. So there are a few things that a character might say that are just obnoxious. Like everything that Toby says throughout this whole book. But an actor who has some skill and some charm might be able to sell it to me. This is an idea that makes perfect sense to me. Despite my broad interest in pretty much everything Marvel, I honestly have a really hard time reading Iron Man comics. I just don't think that Tony Stark is cool or interesting or charming, like at all, in a comic book format. But then you give me RDJ as Tony Stark, and I'm going to watch your whole film franchise. So this does complicate the reading process as, well, outside of Morgan and the Rawhide Kid, I kinda hate most of the characters in this story. A lot of them are rude, they're annoying, their jokes fall flat most of the time, which just makes them seem like even more jerks because they're trying to be funny and they're not. And even Rawhide isn't always exempt from this, oftentimes coming off as just a stuck-up asshole. For me, Personally, this is the single worst thing about reading this book. The cast is not super interesting. Reading the book on a month-to-month basis as it was originally released, it's probably not nearly as frustrating of a read, but when you slam those 5 issues down back-to-back like I had to do writing this episode, well, it's a bit of work. And this is collected in trade paperback format, which again presents it as one narrative in one collection, assuming you're going to read it in one sitting. So that doesn't really work for me. There is calling it a subplot is probably giving it a bit too much credit. Zimmerman does invest some time in Cisco Pike and the interactions that he has with his gang. In issue 2, Rawhide actually rides out of town to confront them, hoping to talk them out of attacking Wells Junction anymore. This scene largely serves to underscore how talented and skilled the Rawhide Kid is. He faces down a gang of 12+ men and he walks away largely unscathed. He's honestly just insulted. But it also really serves to undercut Cisco Pike as our bad guy. His introduction here at the beginning isn't bad at all. He comes off as an arrogant, cocky jerk. He's cruel, he's mean. He is a villain that you enjoy disliking. That stuff works. But the scenes with his gang read more as slapstick comedies, with the gang being too stupid to understand his plans, and Pike being too quick-tempered to get his point across. If I'm laughing at how incompetent our bad guy is, well, then I'm not scared of our bad guy, you know? So that ends up coming across as a real mixed message for me. There is an interesting subplot running through Pike's gang, though. In issue 3, Pike brings in some additional muscle, most of whom don't really get anything interesting done with them. They include the Chinese brothers Yin and Yang, the masked French swordsman called Le Saber, the indigenous medicine man Thunderclaw, and the aptly named Catastrophe Jen. And she is where things get interesting for me. Catastrophe Jen's name is clearly derived from Calamity Jane, a real-world figure in the Wild West. Jen is a tall, thick black woman and easily the most competent and intelligent of Pike's allies. When the gang members hit on her unwantedly, she kills them. And not even with any kind of fanfare, she just stabs them or tosses a dagger into their throats. Pike actually has to plead with her to stop killing his men. They aren't easy to replace. And she mollifies him by complimenting his plan, and it works. Jen is strong, she's smart, and she does not brook anyone else's nonsense. It is also strongly hinted at that Jen is a lesbian. When the gang heads into town for the final confrontation, Pike says that they're gonna shoot anyone they find and burn the town down. But Jen cuts him off. "What about the whores?" she asks. "You said that we could," and then Pike cuts her off. "Damn it, woman, one thing at a time! You're worse than the cowboys," he complains. This connects quite interestingly with the final scene's violence between the Pike gang and the Rawhide Kid, because Jen is nowhere to be seen in them at all. Every other member of his gang that is named, including his allies, are defeated by the Rawhide Kid. But Jen is a mystery. She's just not there. When Morgan and Laura are getting married after the confrontation, we see Jen at the wedding with a busty woman standing next to her, suggesting that Jen not only abandoned Pike in order to visit the whorehouse, but that she found someone there worth spending more time with. And Jen has a Deputy Star badge on her chest, taking up the role now that Rawhide is going to be moving on. The Marvel Fandom Wiki suggests that Jen is a man-hating lesbian, and giving Zimmerman's constant challenging and reinforcing of stereotypes, this wouldn't surprise me, but honestly, I never picked up on the man-hating part. Was she willing to kill men? Well, sure she was, but so was Rawhide. To me and my admittedly straight eyes, it read more like a woman defending herself from rapacious, morally challenged men. If she let any of the gang's comments about her slide, then they would keep making them, and they could escalate from there, and so she cut them down quickly and literally. Given that Jen takes up the role of deputy and would then have to answer to Morgan, a man, I don't really think that she is a man-hater. She's certainly ready to kill, and given that Morgan is not, he might need someone like that in his employ. All of that said, I think it's really cool to see such a background character get an actual kind of arc in this book. Jen shows up as a one-note villainess and then ends the book in a relationship and with a job as a deputy, with nearly no story work being done with her or time devoted to her at all. That's some solid writing to me. There are also a ton of references in this comic. In the first issue, when Morgan meets Pike, he comments that he thought he heard that Pike was around Lonesome Dove. Pike retorts that, yeah, he had a run-in with some old rangers named Woodrow Call and Augustus McCrae. This is a pretty bold reference to the book series / TV show / movie called Lonesome Dove, starring Robert Duvall and Tommy Lee Jones. There is a bandit in that movie who is named Blue Duck, who is clearly the inspiration for Pike's best friend's name, the guy named Red Duck. This is kind of neat because we have seen Marvel's Westerns reference the other titles already and reference real-world history. Broadening those frame of references to just Western storytelling in general is kind of a neat idea. Maybe Zimmerman and Marvel can't use the exact characters from Lonesome Dove, as their names are spelled differently, but they can nod at them and appreciate their role in the overall history of Westerns. This idea is repeated in Laura's character, whose full name, as I stated, is Laura Ingalls, a clear nod to author Laura Ingalls, with an A, of the Little House on the Prairie books. In the comic, Laura references her father and his advice several times, which I'm sure are nods to the books, and she even mentions living in a small house on the plains, so again, I get it. Is this a funny reference? Is it clever? Does it inform Laura's character at all? I don't think so, and so the joke aspect of this reference falls kind of flat for me. As with all reference humor, if you're unfamiliar with the thing that is being referenced, then you just don't get it. And that is something that does happen a couple times in this series. When Morgan needs to replace his deputy after he is shot in issue 1, he interviews a handful of colorful characters, one of whom is named Bernard Fife, spelled P-H-I-F-E. Very clearly a nod to Barney Fife, F-I-F-E, one of the stars of the Andy Griffith Show and sheriff of the town of Mayberry. I recognize the name. I understand that there is a reference here to that show, but I don't know enough about the Andy Griffith Show for this reference to contextualize the joke at all. So it feels weird seeing such a specifically drawn person appear on the page and know that it means something, but not quite grasp what that meaning is. In issue 3, 2 more men show up to apply for the job of deputy, but Rawhide has already volunteered for it. These 2 men introduce themselves as House and Little Joe Cartwright, and they are nods to the TV series Bonanza. When they introduce themselves, Rawhide even looks at the camera. So if this being a reference wasn't obvious to you already, we have another hint that something is going on here. Even Rawhide sees that there's a joke. There is also this weird thing where the mayor of Wells Junction, who is named Walker Bush, is clearly meant to be President George Walker Bush Jr., a nickname that I've never heard. Not only does Severin perfectly capture W's face and expressions, but there was a joke about his father and brother winning him his position in town, a clear nod to Bush's 2000 presidential win. But this is only a clever reference if it informs the mayor's character. And it doesn't, at least as far as I can tell. And as a joke, well, it's 3 years too old to be topical at the time of publication, and now it is almost 20 years too old to be funny. It's just weird. It feels so out of place, and I don't know why it's here. I must commend the artwork by John Severin and colorist Steve Bucalato. I love how this book looks. Severin's style manages to capture the clothes, the buildings, the dirt and grimy feel of the American West without the book being dark and moody like Blaze of Glory was. His characters are really well rendered, like, holy crap. I have never seen anyone draw such distinct and notable faces like Severin's are in this comic. I understand why Jack Kirby used them as reference. As I noted, there is a picture of Mayor Walker that looks so much like Bush Jr. that I had to rub my eyes when I first saw it just because I thought I was looking at a photograph. The book uses very few solid blacks for the inking, preferring hatched line work and small scratches to fill in the space instead, which makes everything look a little more scratchy. Everything, though, looks really solid and just real in this. I honestly love it. And this dedication to drawing everything well doesn't mean that everything looks photorealistic. There are several comedic background characters who are drawn much more cartoony and caricaturized in order to sell the joke, and those drawings work really well. I have literally never seen John Severin's line work before reading this comic, and I am so glad that I finally get to look at it. This book is great visually. Bucalato largely maintains realistic colors for his palette, so we get a lot of browns, greens, and gray in this. The coloring and the line work really help make this book feel like it is from an older time of comics, but with modern production techniques. There's nothing about this that is flashy or over the top. Picking my favorite single image from this book would be impossible, as nothing, unfortunately, stands out in my mind. But everything about this book is so well done, other than, I'll admit, some minor printing errors that led to the color lines not matching up with the line work. I think that, in general, this book is much better than comic history has judged it. There is a lot of thematic work that is great and complex, and conceptually, I kind of love this. Reading this particular book and having it roll inside my head for a few weeks is really the thing that led to me wanting to talk about Western comics. Now, is this the best Western comic that I have ever read? No, definitely not. But is it a good read? I actually think so. It is not amazing, don't get me wrong, and there are few comic books that I would call amazing. It had flaws, and it does have some things that annoy me at times, but I think that it's got real heart and depth to it, and I super appreciate that. Which brings me back to the initial cause of outrage about this book, that they made the Rawhide Kid gay. I have to say, I understand the outrage from the perspective of a fan of continuity. The Rawhide Kid had existed for, at the time of publication, 60 years, and there had never been any indication that the character was gay in those 60 years. Even in the reimagined continuity of Ostrander's Apache Skies, we saw a romance flare up between Rosa and the Rawhide Kid. This retcon didn't sit well with some fans simply because it was a retcon, and I'll fully admit, it also didn't sit well because some people just don't want to see gay folks represented in media. However, the Marvel Universe has always been changing, on an issue-to-issue basis sometimes. Even during the foundational days of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, there were often continuity errors or minor retcons that needed to be made as time went on. Marvel and DC have always retroactively changed their titles in the name of telling a better, more interesting, more modern story, and this is just another example of that. Now, what a good story is will vary from person to person. I think that making the Rawhide Kid gay in this story allows the story to examine what it means to be a man, what it means to be a hero, and how being gay does not negatively affect either of those things, especially because it used to be that was the case in America, where if you were gay, it automatically canceled out any of the other positive attributes about your personality. So I think some of the story work that this book does is great, and as I've said, I really enjoy those aspects of this story.
But Ben,
someone cries,
why not just tell the story with some other Western hero? Why not just make a new cowboy who's already gay?
And the answer to that is the same answer that Marvel and DC always have when they make changes to existing characters. Because no one cares about new characters. Like, we've got a couple of comic books coming up in this series that feature new Western heroes or new Western concepts, and you know how many of those books have gone on to be ongoing series? Or had their characters feature in prominent roles in other Marvel comics? None. Zero. None of them have. If Marvel removed the part about the Rawhide Kid character being gay at all, no one would have cared about this book being released. There's just not enough weight behind the Rawhide Kid IP. There's not enough general interest. There are, however, a lot of people who will buy a comic series that they want to hate just so that they can hate it. And the news of making the Rawhide Kid gay would certainly draw more attention to the book in general, and get Marvel a lot of new press. This is the part about this kind of storytelling move that fascinates me. Because on the one hand, I would think that most of the longtime Rawhide Kid fans, like readers who have followed this character since the 70s or the 80s, who knew of him from hunting down his back issues, I would think that they would dislike this book based on the sudden change to Rawhide. Remove the fact that the change was to make him gay at all, I would just be upset that you changed my character, I don't like that you changed my character. So let's assume that you're pissing off the old fans. Well, that means you're selling this book to the new readers. And would new readers be interested in a story featuring a character that they have maybe never heard of? When this comic came out back in 2001, I would have been 19-ish, and I would have been buying comics for almost 10 years at that point. I just barely had internet access, and I had one small local comic shop. And I certainly had no clue about these Western heroes and the titles that they came from. So, as a then-contemporary new reader, I certainly did not give a no swearing about this book. I never bought it. The only thing that I ever heard about it at all was that the Rawhide Kid was gay, and that's not a selling point to me, so it didn't move me. That isn't something that's going to draw me into a book if I'm not already interested in the book. So that leaves yet another divide of the audience. If it isn't being sold to the old readers, and it isn't being sold to the casual new fan, well, now we're down to the people who just want to read comic books about LGBTQ plus characters. And those readers certainly exist, I'm not arguing that, but are they enough of a shopping force to will this kind of book into existence? And would they then enjoy a comic that features such a stereotypical presentation of how a gay man behaves, while also challenging those very stereotypes? I don't know. I honestly don't know. This comic did sell well enough that Marvel would go on to release a sequel series, which we're going to cover next episode, so clearly there was something there, and somebody at Marvel had to greenlight this book, which means they thought it was a story worth telling. Was it a story worth telling because they wanted to make a bunch of money on it, though, which to me seems unlikely, or is it a story that they were telling in order to make their comic books more representative of the culture at the time? And honestly, for one of the few times you're probably ever going to hear me say this, this feels more like a comic book being made to broaden the social structure of the Marvel Universe as opposed to make a dollar, which just kind of boggles my mind. Overall, for my personal tastes, this comic is better than all of the hate and decrying that I have heard online about it. I think that it has some really solid themes, I think that it has a strong emotional heart, and I think that it has some of the best artwork that I have experienced on this journey through the Marvel West so far. Does it struggle with presenting relatable, enjoyable characters, though? It sure does. Is it as funny as the author thought that it was? It sure isn't. Is it bad that the Rawhide Kid was retconned into being gay for this story? I don't think so. Even artist John Severin didn't have a problem with it, and he was there back in the day, drawing the character's original existence. Marvel clearly hadn't quite figured out how to tell stories featuring LGBTQ plus characters yet, without also making that a huge selling point of the series. But I do think that this is certainly one of Marvel's most notable steps at inclusion and improved representation. It is a shame that such a series isn't very good, but they were still figuring it out at the time, and I would argue that they have become much better at it over the years. So, give them some credit. Next time, we will be continuing to ride alongside the Rawhide Kid, but we won't be the only ones to do so. In order to save the Earp brothers from the dangerous Christo Pike, Rawhide is going to need some additional help. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.8 of the Marvel West, Rawhide Kid and the Sensational Seven. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.